All right, I'm now joined by Jacobin deputy editor Micah Uetricht, and in just a moment we're going to be talking about an article that he wrote for The Nation about Mike Davis. But first, for just a minute, I want to talk to him about this, which is something that happened a few years ago, of course, during the 2016 election cycle, but which he just wrote about for Jacobin.
In the last debate, I believe in her book, very good book, by the way. In her book and in this last debate, she talked about getting the approval or the support or the mentoring of Henry Kissinger. Now, I find it rather amazing because I happen to believe that Henry Kissinger was one of the most destructive secretaries of state in the modern history of this country. I am proud to say that Henry Kissinger is not my friend. I will not take advice from Henry Kissinger. And in fact, Kissinger's actions in Cambodia, when the United States bombed that country, overthrew Prince Sihanouk, created the instability for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to come in, who then butchered some 3 million innocent people, one of the worst genocides in the history of the world. So count me in as somebody who will not be listening to Henry Kissinger.
So that came up in my Facebook memories on, I believe it was Friday. And I, of course, remember the line, Henry Kissinger is not my friend. I've quoted that many times, but I hadn't watched the full video in a while. And when I watched it, I was just like, I was in my apartment and I was here with my roommate, Sean, and I was just like, yeah! I was just so fucking hyped watching that because I forgot how much of a smackdown it was. It was so good. And I just I dropped what I was doing for like 2 hours. I was like, I have to write this because this is like one of the greatest moments. As I say, half jokingly, half kind of not. If this is the only thing that came out of Bernie's campaign, it's all fucking worth it because this is not like, stop me if I'm ranting too much.
No, please.
Anything yet. Sorry. I'm just getting hyped just watching it again. It's Bernie Sanders, his agenda was mostly a domestic social democratic agenda, right? It was like Medicare for all. It was, we're going to get free college for everybody. We're going to get rid of medical debt, et cetera, et cetera. And some people sometimes said, well, Bernie, yeah, that sounds good, but like, what about American imperialism? And it's true, he could have talked about American imperialism more, but it's not like he didn't talk about American imperialism ever. And it is clear to me that Bernie has a bone deep anti-imperialism that you can see from the very beginning of his political career as mayor of Burlington, whether it's like using that office for to support the movement for solidarity against U.S. intervention in Central America. Mm-hmm. This is who this guy is. And so, again, he could have done more. He could have talked about things a little differently, but like there were these moments of like anti-imperialist smackdown that we got from Bernie Sanders. And thank God, because who would have ever thought that we'd see this on a Democratic debate stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that in 2016, for the most part, he wasn't that eager to talk about this stuff. He'd sort of do this weird thing where he'd talk about the King of Jordan. He'd pivot.
He loved talking about the King Abdullah of Jordan.
and he'd kind of pivot back to talking about the big banks. But even in 2016, much less 2020, when I think he just kind of said fuck it and embraced this stuff much more.
Yeah.
But even in 2016, there were these moments where it really came through. This being the most striking one. I think also, I think there were a few of them. Like I remember even in 2016 at a debate stage in Miami, he conspicuously refused to walk back the comments that he made about Cuba and Nicaragua, in the 80s, and obviously that came back in a big way in 2020. But I mean, this was actually for somebody who didn't always seem sure of himself when he was talking about this stuff. Like this was just remarkably good. Like because it's sort of, even though you could tell that it's like something that in typical Bernie-ish fashion, he just can't not say,
right.
Like, this just needs to come out as like Henry Kissinger, But it's also, I remember thinking at the time, it was very artfully done like that, because he's also talking about Henry Kissinger's war crimes, but he's doing it in a specific way that connects a pretty clear dot to what was going on then. Because in 2016, there was all this, the big foreign policy discussion that was dominating everything was ISIS, the Islamic State in the Middle East. And he doesn't quite explicitly spell this out, but I mean, I can't imagine anybody watching this and not kind of getting the analogy that he's drawing about, Kissinger's crimes in Cambodia leading to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, and the invasion that Hillary Clinton supported in Iraq, leading to the rise of the Islamic State.
Yep. And also, obviously, this kind of rhetoric that we got from him opened the door for other things like Ilhan Omar grilling Elliot Abrams over his human rights atrocities, kind of like mini Henry Kissinger and Elliot Abrams. So, the new American left that, has been born since this first campaign, since moments like these 5 years ago, again, not perfect. Again, they could do things differently, but like anti-imperialism is on the agenda, and it apparently occasionally shows up in their public rhetoric, and thank God for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that one's called "It Was All Worth It to Hear Bernie Say 5 Years Ago, Henry Kissinger is Not My Friend," and that's in Jacobin. You were going to say?
And can I just mention that, aside from the specificity of what this clip was about, part of the reason I wrote this is because I know a lot of people, I say this in the intro of the piece, are using things like the Facebook memories function and going back to where they were 1 year ago today or 5 years ago today. And I know a lot of my friends and comrades are, posting pictures. Like a year ago today, I was in Iowa knocking on doors for Bernie Sanders. A year ago today, I was doing X, Y, and Z to get, to try to get Bernie elected. And that's bringing back a real flood of emotions for people. And, we were at such, I'm sure this is true of you. I'm sure it's true of many of your listeners. We were like at the peak in our lives in terms of like thinking of what was politically possible in the United States of America 1 year ago today. We were thinking that Bernie G.D. Sanders was actually going to become president of the United States. And obviously we've fallen very far from there in everything that has happened since that year. But so in writing this stuff out, I just wanted to kind of affirm that feeling that a lot of people are going through. Because I watched this video and I was reminded, oh yeah, like everything that we did is worth it. And this video was coming up at in my memories, the same time as when I was in Iowa and when I was doing all these things for Bernie. So people should, acknowledge that emotion and sort of, they should affirm it. They should be like, yes, it was the correct thing to do, to throw everything that I had into the Bernie Sanders campaign. To try to get this guy elected. Because why? Well, for one thing, he did shit like this. He said, Henry Kissinger is not my friend.
Yeah, no question. And I mean, I guess I remember 2012 when it was things were dismal enough that the closest you got to to get anything like this, you actually had to watch the Republican debates, because crazy old semi-libertarian reactionary Ron Paul would at least have moments when he said very honest and things about U.S. imperialism, but actually getting to hear it from the left. I mean, that's definitely an underrated virtue of the Bernie campaigns.
Yeah.
So thinking about that. Where things were, a year ago, which, I mean, obviously it's pretty brutal in many ways to think back to that. I mean, I know certainly in my case, although I don't think actually any element of this is unique, but certainly in my case, I think that, a lot of stuff that's somewhat related, but not completely related is very mixed up in that, when I think about, what things were like this time a year ago, because a lot of things were better, right? Bernie Sanders winning the presidential, contest, we could go outside. You know, those are definitely two of the big ones.
Go outside, could go inside.
Yeah.
Go in a lot of places.
You could just do all kinds of things. You could go to bars, you could go to restaurants.
Dude, you don't even know what life was like back then, okay? It was crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
We went inside, we went outside, we went many places, wherever we wanted. It was nuts.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, I mean, and of course also, you know, I mean, it's definitely mixed up in my head with, you know, with Michael Brooks still being alive, you know, because like that was, I remember like a year and a little bit less than a week ago, you know, was at the end of the weekend that I was in, in Brooklyn for the last TMBS live show, and you know, I mean, the last time I saw him in person, you know, was the end of that weekend, and I remember, you know, we kind of had lunch, you know, at the end of the weekend. I've been crashing with him and his girlfriend in Brooklyn, and my wife had been staying with a friend in New Jersey, but we all got together for lunch on the last day, and that conversation, you know, which was a very happy time, was all very much bound up in the fact that Bernie was winning. That like I remember, Jennifer telling, you know, Michael, it's the first time they'd met, you know, that every time Ben is watching YouTube, he's either watching you or Bernie, and you know, in typical Michaelish fashion, the response was, "Yeah, that's correct. That's what you should watch."
That's a well-balanced diet right there.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. But this whole business of thinking about past defeats and how we relate to them is all over the place in this long piece that you wrote for The Nation, which I believe is actually, as of this morning when I was looking at the website, is in the list of the most popular articles that they've published in like the last couple of weeks.
It's very bizarre to me. I mean, it's like, who would have guessed that so many people want to read like 6,000 words about this old socialist writer? Just not what I would have expected. But I'm very grateful that people are reading it.
Yeah. So this is about Mike Davis, who's a historian and theorist, author of a bunch of big, thick books, all of which you read, which for this, which I'm very impressed by, because I mean, I don't, like, you know, no false modesty, I can write quickly, but I think I read much more slowly than you do.
Well, it was also like the entire summer. Like, what did you read last summer? I read Mike Davis. That was what I read.
Fair enough. So let's get into this. So for people who might not be that familiar with him, like, want to give us a little bit of a sense of who this guy is? Yeah.
So Mike Davis, how old is he now? I should know this off the top of my head. He's in his 70s. He's a sort of product of the new left in many ways. I mean, he was born into a working class family in Southern California. Was like a Reed College dropout, but eventually got involved in SDS in the 60s, became a regional organizer for SDS, and was involved in, the major struggles of the day, the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I talk about, where he was at during all of those, especially in Southern California. He's also showing up in Texas, and he's a kind of a Zelig-like figure in a bunch of stuff that's going on in the New Left in the 60s. And so he gets politicized and radicalized during that time. And he does not then become Mike Davis, the public intellectual. Instead, he becomes Mike Davis, or not becomes, he returns to what he was before he started working with SDS, which was Mike Davis, the truck driver. So he had driven big rig trucks. He had delivered meat for a meat company. He spent a number of years in California working class jobs, and was somebody who was politicized. He became a socialist, but at one point I mentioned all of these stray biographical details. Like, for example, he worked in the Communist Party bookstore in Southern California and was kicked out when he started haranguing the Soviet cultural attaché who was visiting the bookstore, because despite being a member of the Communist Party, he was really not a big fan of the Soviet Union. So he left the party soon after that when he chased the guy out of the bookstore, which that's a kind of like morsel that sort of indicates to you the sort of eccentricities of this guy, the eccentricities that are going to be present throughout the rest of his.
You mentioned the article that part of the reason he joined the CP is that he was impressed that they had condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, but I guess harassing the Soviet cultural attaché at the bookstore is a bridge too far.
Yeah, you can only get away with so much in the party. So he has this background. He works driving a truck for a long time. And by the way, it's very hard. Writing this piece was very difficult to piece together his biography because like he's never written like a memoir, or there aren't any like biographies of him out there. And so you have to piece them together from like a million different places, or like stray anecdotes that he tells here and there, which is actually why I wrote this article in the first place, is because I told somebody, like, I just started reading Mike Davis and I was like, somebody really needs to like make this guy sit down and write a memoir, because his life is insane. Like the more details you learn, I've only got a sprinkling in this piece of all of the crazy stuff he's done in his life, which then led to somebody then asking me to like, well, why don't you write a profile of him? So, but anyway, so he goes to drive a truck, and he didn't go to college initially. He was driving a truck for several years, and as I think he mentioned somewhere, it's sort of like reading Capital like during his break when he's delivering whatever throughout, driving around Southern California. And he eventually does go back to school, I think later in his 20s or in his early 30s, and through a series of events falls in with the New Left Review, the left journal based in the UK. And that kind of starts his writing career. And he started a PhD in history, never finished it. And his first book is published. He was somebody who was politicized through the New Left, in the 60s, but his first book doesn't come out until 1986. That's when he first writes Prisoners of the American Dream, which is this overview of the American labor movement.
Yeah, and before we go there, I think that we can't leave the New Left Review years without mentioning a couple.
You're right. That's criminal of me to just try to gloss over that. Well, because these are, there's a great profile of him that was written by Adam Schatz for the now defunct magazine Lingua Franca, and Schatz has this great line, which I've been told it's been confirmed by multiple people that these events did indeed take place. I think I write in the piece that like his time at the New Left Review is where he sort of develops this reputation as a bit of a loose cannon, which includes things like I'll just read from the piece. Davis received a letter from the historian Eugene Genovese, complaining about the journal's treatment of his work. And Genovese, of course, is like one of the most important historians of the 20th century. And he complaining about this, and Mike responds with his own letter, "Dear Professor Genovese, fuck you." And then in another moment of editorial anger, which, by the way, nobody who I've talked to seems to know like what he was even angry about here. They just remember what the product of his anger was. After another moment of editorial anger, Davis spilled his atrarium filled with a garter snake, an axolotl, and a carnivorous African toad onto the office's lush carpet. I don't even know what an axolotl is. I should have probably looked that up. I have no clue. It sounds like something you don't want on the New Left Review carpet, though.
Probably not.
So he develops this, and in the Schatz profile, he talks about, for example, being this working class guy, former truck driver, surrounded by these like Oxford and Cambridge educated types, the public school types in the UK, and he's just like very much a fish out of water. But it just sort of makes for this funny scene where like you got this sort of bowl in the china shop that is Mike Davis doing things like dropping poisonous toads on the carpet of the bougie offices of the New Left Review.
I guess you probably can't speak to Brooklyn, but that's at least never happened in the Chicago Jacobin office.
Sean Goody, sometimes he's not happy about the editorial decisions that I make, but he has never released any poisonous animals onto the floor of our office. But there's time.
Fair enough. So when does so it's pretty like so when does Davis actually start writing books in this progression?
The first one, Prisoners of the American Dream, comes out in 1986.
Okay. Which is also significant, going back to the point about how this grappling with left defeats, becomes such a big part of what he's doing, because this is, 1986. This is 3 years before the, collapse of the Soviet bloc, which maybe he wasn't the biggest fan of, but like ushers in all of this end of history capitalist triumphalism.
Right. It's the height of Reaganism. Things are real bad. I mean, the working class movement has been all but defeated. Deindustrialization has taken hold. It's the height of the, cultural and political revanchism of the Reagan years, really trying to roll back the gains of the feminist movement and the civil rights movement and the labor movement. It's the 80s, like in full swing, and all the badness that means. And what is unique about him in that first book, and then as I argue in the piece, what's unique about the rest of his writing career, with the exception of the more recent books, is that he refuses to take any kind of false solace anywhere. And I say that as somebody who has himself, I've written plenty of pieces of, it's like, oh, this thing happened in the labor movement. Like maybe the labor movement's going to turn the corner here, like maybe this time we're finally going to get, we're going to pull back from the abyss, and like things will turn around. Because I don't want to be all doom and gloom all the time. It seems politically kind of not that useful, but Davis has absolute sobriety, especially beginning with that first book. If you read that book, it's not a if you're somebody who likes it, maybe if you're like Milton Friedman and you read that book, you feel heartened. But like if you're a leftist, you're like, damn, we are in rough shape right now.
Fair enough. And yeah, so you, one of the things actually I should say that you say right at the beginning of the piece and go back to is that like Davis has a history of correctly predicting all sorts of terrible things, that have happened. I mean, so he's definitely not a peddler of false hope. He's somebody who's talking about how the labor movement was going to keep declining. He's somebody who's talking about various environmental catastrophes before they really reach public consciousness. He's somebody who was talking about the danger of pandemics overwhelming the public healthcare system long before COVID.
Yes. So his first book that really breaks through into the mainstream is his second book, which is called City of Quartz, and it's a book that is just it's an astonishingly original synthesis of so many strands of history and culture in Los Angeles, and it's describing what is the state of the city of Los Angeles when it comes out, which I believe was 1990. I'm not positive about that off the top of my head. Yes, 1990. And it comes out shortly before Rodney King and the LA riots, and it's describing this pressure cooker atmosphere of incredible urban inequality in Los Angeles. And it, shortly after it comes out, these major riots pop off in LA, and he's seen as a kind of prophet. I mean, the book comes out and people are like, whoa, like, what is this? This book's wild. And then it seems to almost predict the explosions of the Rodney King riots. And after that, he becomes this kind of intellectual celebrity. And, what a strange and unlikely thing, this Marxist former truck driver in 1990 or in the early 1990s at the height of, just finished up with Reaganism, and it's sort of seamlessly transitioned into the era of Clintonism, or about to transition into Clintonism of the 90s. And, as I said, it's like the go-go 80s and 90s. It's the capitalist triumphalism is like in full swing. And then this guy shows up and drops a turd in the punch bowl, and then is seen as being like actually quite accurate in how he was describing the state of the city. And what's amazing about Davis is that he becomes this intellectual celebrity. I think I read somewhere, I didn't put this in the profile, but I think Bruce Willis was once photographed, I think, for the New York Times Magazine, and he's got a copy of City of Quartz like in the background on a table or something like that. It's like that's the kind of stuff that was happening with Mike Davis. And he becomes like a genuine intellectual celebrity. He wins like a Genius Grant, and he's got all these people knocking on his door, screenwriters and famous academics, and he's being feted to lecture all around the world. And he could have really sort of cashed in on this newfound intellectual fame that he has. And in the Adam Schatz profile, he talks about how Davis was at one point under contract to write a book after the LA riots about the LA riots. That would have been the smart career move to do when you're seen as the guy who predicted the LA riots. Then you should write a book after the LA riots. And he starts working on it, and he can't stomach it. He gets deeply involved in former gang members in Los Angeles who are trying to broker truces and are actually advancing this incredible social democratic agenda. And they're talking about, increasing funding for jobs rather than more police, stuff that sounds pretty familiar today. And he decides that he just can't pull it off. It's too heartbreaking to deal with the reality of these gang members' lives in the form of a book treatment. And he never writes that book follow-up, which to me says a lot about who he is and like his sort of, it's almost like he thought that writing that book would have just been too easy, and like he didn't want to just cash in on his intellectual fame. I mean, he had a whole interesting career where he's helping gang members broker truces, but he was less interested in cashing in to write a big book that would become a New York Times bestseller or something. And that's something that I deeply admire about him.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's so interesting that not only in that time, he becomes this kind of like, both scholarly and popular, figure in that way. But like also somebody who, he didn't, just in case this got lost earlier, he was back in school for a while, but he never finished a PhD. He was spending his time driving trucks, throwing, like dropping poisonous and carnivorous animals onto the floor of the New Left Review, so he's clearly not, interested in following that kind of, or sufficiently interested in following that kind of academic track, but is also not interested in following the track of, following up and, like you said, writing the kind of book that people would have expected him to write as a follow-up, or sort of trying to capitalize on what he'd already done in a way that would have been kind of like rationally self-interested, like presumably if he has a book agent, the kind of advice that agent's giving him.
No, the agent is like, please, Mike, please write the book, please. I need it, you need it, we all need it. Please write the book. And he's like, I don't think so.
Yeah. So take us into the 90s. We talked about City of Quartz. So what does he write after this?
So the next book that he writes is also about Southern California, but it is not the one that we thought he would write. The follow up to the LA riots. It's called Ecology of Fear. It comes out in 1998, and another just astonishingly wild synthesis of a book. Not at all what you would expect him to be writing given his history. And what's most notable about this book, which is about the ecology of Southern California, is how he's written this first book, Prisoners of the American Dream, about the organized working class in America, which is probably not surprising for a Marxist historian, right? We're all concerned with this question of the state of the working class movement. And he looks at that movement, and why do we pay attention to it? Because the organized working class is, the most important agent of social change to bring about the world that we all want. So he looks at that and he finds that it's good.
Yeah, and I should say, by the way, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people watching or listening know this, but I mean, I think something that's always worth taking a second to emphasize, when we talk about this, is that the reason that that socialists have traditionally looked to the working class, as that agent of change, isn't necessarily thinking that that the working class is like is like the most oppressed or most morally deserving, element of society. That's not it, right? I mean, at the time that Marx is writing, peasants, elements of the urban poor that aren't even in the working class are doing worse off. Like that's not the question. The question is being in a structural position to shut down society, because it all relies on its labor, and having a collective interest in achieving the kind of better society that that we'd all want, right? So that's why that's why we're interested in that. But then when he looks at this, says, okay, but how that question of structural power, what kind of agency the working class it has, that's not just like a fixed quantity forever. Like that's been affected by past defeats. That's been affected by the way capitalism has changed.
Right. Yeah, all that's true. And so he is not feeling particularly great about the prospect of organized labor to turn around anytime soon. He thinks it's important, of course, but he's not forecasting a turning the corner on the attacks on the labor movement, the decline in its power. And so what he does in 1988 with Ecology of Fear is identify this other second concern of his writing career, which is the first one was workers, and the second one is the weather. And when you say the weather, I mean, obviously now lots of people are talking about climate change, and he writes about climate change sometimes, but that's not really what he means. I mean, he's concerned with like the weather as its own like autonomous agent in constructing and reshaping the world. He sees it as like an agent who it's important to like understand that it just sort of functions of its own accord, and like petty human exertions to try to change that or to conquer it or to ignore it are the height of human folly, and the weather will have its last laugh. And so the book is about the ecology of Southern California, and I mean just it's you name it. I mean, tornadoes, fires, wildfires, earthquakes, squirrels bearing bubonic plague, cougars coming in from the mountains to like terrorize the children of who live in suburban tract homes that just got built. I mean, it's all about how the ecology of Southern California is, as he describes it, a revolutionary, not reformist landscape. And as this sort of center of like real estate development, like pushing into every nook and cranny wherever it can go in Southern California, and California in general as being sort of like it's the West. It's like it's like almost like a frontier mentality, and we're gonna conquer all this stuff, and we're gonna tame the wilderness. And a bunch of the book is about how foolish this is, and how the weather is untamable. I write in the profile about the most famous chapter in the book, which is called "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn," and it's all about how this area of Southern California, Malibu. Folks know the name. Everyone remembers hopefully everyone remembers the Hole song, the lesser known Hole song from the 90s, Malibu, where there's fires burning in the video, actually. This is this place where movie stars and entertainment executives and like rich people live, and it's also the place where there's just uncontrollable wildfires that sweep through it because of the specificities of Malibu's ecology on a regular basis. And I write in the piece about how he's talking about this sort of contest between these extremely wealthy movie stars and executives and the fires. And it's very clear who he's rooting for in that contest. He's like, it's almost like he was like, well, the workers couldn't pry these, multi-million-dollar homes out of these people's hands, but maybe the fires will take care of it. I mean, that's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true.
Yeah.
Like he would prefer that workers could do so in a more like organized and rational way and redistribute the resources. But in the absence of that, like the fires sweep through and really just obliterate these people time and again. So that is an indicative of where his agenda is going, and sort of seeing the weather as I said, an autonomous agent, as another agent of social change, like socialists talk about the working class. He doesn't just say the weather's important. Listen, he says it does its own thing, and like the whole problem with capitalism is that it is incapable of ever respecting any kind of ecological limits. It's incapable of like living in awe and reverence and respect of the autonomous power of nature, of the weather. It's always trying to, as I said, colonize into new nooks and crannies and go where it shouldn't go. Build suburban tract homes where the cougars used to live, and that's why the cougars then come and like maul their children because they push too far into the cougars' environment, or earthquakes, or everything else. So that becomes a really central preoccupation of his from then on.
Yeah, and this connects. I don't remember which book you said this was in, but now I do. It's Late Victorian Holocausts, which is another it's another book that he writes. Like you get this sort of preoccupation with the weather, with these with climate and all that stuff. Among other things, because he's talking about famines that are caused by British colonial policy that are kind of blamed on the weather, that are sort of blamed on these like El Nino kind of weather events, but he dissects why that's at least severely misleading.
Yeah. Famines happen in, like, for example, colonial, British controlled India, and people are just like, oh, well, act of God, thousands and tens of thousands of people are dying around us. By the way, people should read it. It's a very good book, but it is an absolutely brutal book. I mean, some of the worst things that you have ever read in terms of just how the British, for example, have no compunction about letting Indians starve, and the human catastrophes that were committed in the context of bringing these countries, in the heyday of like liberal capitalism, 19th century liberal capitalism. And his point, he goes into great depth about these El Nino weather systems. There's actually a blurb in my copy from like a meteorologist, some guy who is an academic meteorologist, and he goes into great depth of understanding the science. He doesn't just gloss over it. He's like, I need to understand these things on their own terms. But he's pointing out again in relation to the like capitalism cannot live in a sort of peaceful coexistence with the weather. That previous to British colonialism, these famines or the El Nino systems would come, and it would make life difficult for farmers. But like Indian peasants had a system for dealing with this. They would have surpluses, etc., and it wouldn't be a humanitarian nightmare. There would not be shriveled up bodies of Indian peasants along the streets of these towns. It was only when the British, appear on the scene and they're demanding that all the production of the Indian peasants go to the British for their own enrichment, and they refuse to provide any substantive aid for these peasants who are starving when the El Nino weather systems hit and they enter into droughts, and so it leads to these humanitarian catastrophes, and it's part of his sort of point about how capitalism just refuses to unlike the Indian peasants who figured out how to survive when there would be these droughts, capitalism refuses to. The imperatives of the market, are such that the British just want to get more and more and more and get richer and richer and richer, and there's these absolute nightmare scenarios for average people like Indian peasants that result from it.
Right. So after late Victorian Holocaust, Davis writes a book called Planet of Slums.
Yeah, so Planet of Slums, that was actually the book that I had read Prisoners of the American Dream years ago, and I read it again in grad school in 2018. But besides that, Planet of Slums was the second Davis book that I had ever read. And there is a blurb on the cover of Planet of Slums that I believe describes reading it as like being struck with anvil blows. And the same can be true. Same is true of like late Victorian Holocausts. But that book in particular, Planet of Slums, very much still worth reading. It is about the sort of supercharged expansion of slums throughout the world, to the tune of several billion people being stuck in slums that are ever expanding outward, that are becoming more and more dense, that are becoming more and more miserable. They're lacking any kind of basic health and safety infrastructure, and they are also expanding, unlike at previous periods of urban expansion in the history of of global capitalism, like in New York City expanding in sort of like late 19th and early 20th century because there were all kinds of industrial jobs that were available, right? So, immigrants are coming to the United States and they're going and working in the needle trades or wherever. In the 21st century, these slums are expanding, and yet there's no concomitant economic development. So the slums just grow more and more and more, but the people who show up there have very few prospects for decent jobs. There's no economic development to speak of really happening in most of these places. People are being absorbed into the informal economy in these cities, which, as we know, is not the most stable way to make a living. And you're just selling your wares to other people who also are working in the informal economy. And it's a very bleak picture. And so he is describing how these slums are expanding. And the book ends, I mentioned in the review that the book ends, and we should mention that the book comes out in the mid-2000s, I believe in 2006, is that right? It's 2005. And it's like, what is going on in 2005? That we've invaded Iraq. Things are incredibly bleak for the American, this is 4 years after 9/11. And so the sort of, there was a rising tide of some kind of protest activity around the anti-globalization movement. And then, 9/11 happens, and we all know what happens after that, including the invasion of Iraq. And so it's a very bleak time to be a liberal, much less a leftist in the world. And the book really, Planet of Slums really reflects that sense of despair that I know I felt at that time. I was very young. That was when I first got politicized in the Bush years. But it reflects that sense of despair. And the book ends in him talking about, well, sort of what are the prospects for these new, increasing number of people who are crowded into these slums in these miserable conditions. Things are so miserable. Well, surely then the slum dwellers will revolt, right? And then he talks about how the Pentagon and the Rand Corporation are planning to, he quotes all of these studies that they have released about the plans for urban warfare, on the streets of places like Jakarta or Rio or Fallujah, right? I mean, this really nightmare scenario in which, like, imagining American troops like going down these winding, twisting streets of the favela in Rio, brutally putting down uprisings of these slum dwellers. And he says that there's a real this question of like agency is really missing here. Like, yes, this is a population that is immiserated and is expanding, and people are angry, they're frustrated that they don't have prospects, and they will probably do things like riot once in a while to express that anger. But in terms of having the levers that are actually needed, the structural levers to make social change happen and to improve their lot as slum dwellers, it doesn't look very good. And in fact, like, the future of warfare, a big part of it is going to be focused on urban areas and putting down these kinds of insurrections. So you don't leave that book feeling particularly good, again, about the prospects for social change. He examines this really miserable social phenomenon, and you're basically left thinking like it's gonna just get worse. It's not gonna get better anytime soon.
Yeah, and so I don't want to so we should at least acknowledge, because I want to get to the last couple of books where you say his attitude seems to shift a little bit, although certainly not certainly not offering unqualified optimism, but before we talk about that, I kind of alluded to this earlier, and I think we shouldn't let this go. He wrote a book originally in 2005. You say that was republished in 2020.
Yes, and this gets at his prescience as a writer. I mean, he jokes. I mentioned in the intro of the article that he jokes that leftists like him have successfully predicted 11 of the last 3 crises. But Mike Davis himself has a much better track record in terms of getting these things right, whether it's the labor movement or the problems of the environment. And nowhere is this more true than his writings on pandemics. And he wrote this book in 2005 that was titled "The Monster at Our Door." And I remember I saw this book once years ago in a bookstore, and I was looking at it. I knew who Mike Davis was, and it's got this sort of dramatic picture of a chicken on it, and it's about avian flu. And I was just kind of like, what is this? This seems bizarre alarmism. Why is this guy writing books about this? Sure, avian flu, I guess I've heard of that before. Seems like a problem, but do you really need to call it the monster at our door? Is this really such a big deal, Mike Davis? Little did I know that Mike Davis was very correct. He says in the intro of this new version, which was released in 2020, that OR Books published, called "The Monster Enters," that the book freaked him out so much after he wrote it that in order to write a new edition of it, he actually had to buy another copy of it somewhere, because he didn't want it around him because it freaked him out too much what he had written about. But of course, he turned out to be correct that these pandemics actually were at our door, and now, of course, they've entered, and Mike Davis has been proven right yet again. And just like he wrote about the weather, his part of his argument is capitalism is incapable of putting in the kind of safeguards that we need to stop these kinds of pandemics from taking off. I mean, we need everything that we need to stop these things are exactly what capitalists hate. We need robust public health systems. Certainly not a for-profit health system. My God, no, that's the worst thing we could have in order to prevent these things from happening. We need systems of industrial production or production of food that can that don't encourage the spread of these kinds of diseases. And just like in late Victorian Holocausts, he goes into great detail about how these viruses mutate, how they spread. He takes the science extremely seriously because, again, he lives in awe of these awesome forces of nature that he really doesn't want to fuck with, because he knows the power that they have. And he's yet again proven right with the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet again, Mike Davis, unfortunately, proven correct.
Yeah, right. And there are a lot of actually, I can imagine. I can imagine one of the things that makes it hard to write about this in a disciplined way. Certainly, something that makes it hard even to interview about you about it in a disciplined way is that there's so many connections between these different books that that are, I really want to jump around because in when you were talking about Planet of Slums and you're talking about the Pentagon and Rand Corporation coming up with all these horrifying contingency plans, I immediately jumped to the book he just recently co-wrote, finished co-writing, the Fire Last Time, where he quotes
Set the Night on Fire.
Oh, sorry, what is it?
Set the Night on Fire.
Set the Night on Fire. Thank you. I'm getting my wires crossed with a different book about that era, but yes, thank you. Set the Night on Fire, where he quotes the police chief of the LAPD in 1966, describing policing black neighborhoods in Los Angeles as very much like fighting the Viet Cong.
Right, as well as this didn't make it into the final version of my review, but another book that I read for this review is his book Buddha's Wagon, which is a history of the car bomb, and another just incredibly original book with the sort of the point of what he's saying. He's talking about like what warfare will look like in the 21st century through going through a history of the car bomb. Another just absolutely brutal book, as you may be able to guess. Like car bombs are very blunt instruments to carry out warfare, but like they're increasingly easy to construct. There's just going to be, especially with increasing, inequality around the world and the spread of U.S. imperialism, like the opposition to the sort of like capitalist and imperialist status quo doesn't get defeated. It's never squashed. It just mutates into different forms, and it takes the form of car bombings. And so he gets into that in the book, and in that book, and another book that's very much worth reading, but is very much depressing. And yeah, you can see like similar threads through all of these things. I mean, like the car bomb book, it's like just like the weather, like just like you can't conquer the weather, you also cannot conquer this like human desire to like resist oppression and occupation. And is as I said, as inequality spreads and as imperial power spreads, it just mutates. It just takes different forms, and the results are very not pretty.
Right. Yeah. So let's get into to those last two books, because you say that after this depressingly long track record of correctly predicting catastrophes, and this track record of taking past left movements and working class struggles serious enough not to sugarcoat the consequences of their defeats, without losing any of that. He's not, like he hasn't just sort of traded all that in for blind optimism. But you say in these last couple of books, there is this, there is this different tone that he seems to be responding to the reemergence of the socialist left, in the last several years, and seeing some possibilities that, that maybe weren't as obvious in his previous books.
Yeah, part of what was so fascinating to read 11 of his books for this piece is to sort of like track Mike Davis's mood. And because I think of him as such a rigorous thinker and somebody who will not, as I've said, he's not offering anybody any kind of false solace. He's deadly serious about the things that he's describing. And so when there's a change in his mood after decades of being the bearer of bad news, I take it I'm like, okay, well, if Mike Davis thinks that things are actually looking up, despite the horrors that are continually piling up around us, obviously, the world is still in pretty rough shape right now, right. Whether it's the pandemic, whether it's global warming, I don't need to give you the full list. But like, in spite of that, Mike Davis senses that there is something, qualitatively different happening in our politics right now. Then I take that very seriously. And you get that sense in his two most recent books, Old Gods, New Enigmas, which is a kind of odds and ends essay collection, and Set the Night on Fire, his like almost, I think he would describe it as maybe not his life's work, but something that he's been working on for almost 2 decades at this point.
Yeah, you quote him saying in 2003 that working on this book was his day job.
Yeah, which is funny. I found that in an essay collection from like a decade or over 15 years ago, with his co-author who was interviewing him about it. Old Gods, New Enigmas, I'm not sure I would recommend it as like a first book for Mike Davis readers, because it's so all over the place, but it makes sense in the overall scope of his intellectual career. I mean, the vast majority of the book is people should just read this just to see what Mike Davis is capable of. The first like 2/3, 3/4 of the book is just him sort of like reading through the history of the organized working class globally, especially in the like late 19th and early 20th century, and just sort of like figuring out how the working class got organized. And it's a series of theses, most of which are only like 3 or 4 pages long. And each thesis is like its own book. You're just like, what is this guy on? Like, how is he doing this? I got a copy of it, and I was like sending it out to different writers, and I was like, read page 122 to 124, and then write a Jacobin article about it, because that's a whole article in itself. So yeah, he's like reading through, and he's actually like, despite what we were just talking about in Planet of Slums, that there's this people being shunted into the informal economy, and they're not able to access the same kind of levers of power that the industrial proletariat had access to in the heyday of industrial unionism. He still is arguing that the working class is where the action is. I mean, the organized working class still has the power to change the world, and that's I have to believe that his arguing that is in part a reflection of the changed political situation that we find ourselves in with the working class. I mean, in recent years, we have seen the Chicago Teachers Union go on strike, and then the teachers' strike wave spread all over the country. There's some promising things happening in healthcare, among healthcare workers. So even though the organized working class is still very much beaten down, and even though most of his predictions most of what he was describing in 1986 in Prisoners of the American Dream is still with us, there's like something to cling to here, and his writing is reflecting that. He's like actually still thinks that the organized working class still can transform the world. And then what's most incredible about that book, Old Gods, New Enigmas, is that at the end he writes about climate change, and despite everything, actually is kind of optimistic about our prospects. And he's been writing about cities his whole life, whether it's in Planet of Slums or in City of Quartz. And it's all very dark depictions of urbanized life in the world. And yet he says, the hope for us in winning a sustainable world, one that doesn't burn to a crisp, actually it's in cities themselves. It's in urban spaces. Like, urban spaces hold the potential for us to like build a world that is like livable and enjoyable and dignified for everyone, and can be sustainable, and all the rest of it. So again, this is after he's writing optimistically about workers after a whole career of writing about how beaten down and defeated workers are. He's writing optimistically about the prospects for urban life, a sustainable urban life, and reversing climate change, despite his whole life about writing about the disasters of weather and the disasters of urbanization around the world. And so, as I said, I take that pretty seriously, that he would, after decades of just pummeling himself with this bad news and pummeling the rest of us as he's the bearer of bad news, he's saying, actually these are the places where we actually could have some hope.
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly, God, I hope so. But that is encouraging. So people, I mean, this guy who's written a bunch of books, and they're not short books, but if people want to start somewhere, where do you think they should start?
Well, this is a tough question, because many people have asked me this, understandably. And Set the Night on Fire is his most readable book by far, and it's co-authored with John Wiener, who's a historian. And it's my editor took out my line about how it's 800 pages long, and he took out the line where I said, the pages fly by, but several times when I was reading it, my wrist hurt because it's so heavy. It's a freaking book. But that's the most readable, most enjoyable. Planet of Slums is more classic Davis. He's got these paragraphs that are just so dense. You feel like you're reading, not dense in the terms of like hard to understand, but just like incredible amounts of information packed very succinctly into like a single sentence or a single paragraph. That's certainly how Prisoners of the American Dream is written. But I guess of the more the sober books, Planet of Slums is a great place to start. Ecology of Fear, both City of Quartz and Ecology of Fear are his most original books, and how he's bringing in all of this stuff into under the to make one single argument about Southern California in both cases. It's like sensational reading. If you are much of a reader, who just enjoys like the crafting of an original and compelling book, like you can't do much better than City of Quartz or Ecology of Fear. But like people should. He's someone who's very much worth spending time on. I mean, if you want to read 11 of his books, I found it a very rewarding experience. I guess I should say that if you'll forgive the self-promotion, I mean, I think that what I have written here is the best introduction to Mike Davis that you can get. And so if you read this first, it will help orient you towards this guy's career and understanding like what he was doing at these different moments of his career. And if I could just say one more thing about him, I mean, I'm saying that he has this sense of optimism, and it's not Pollyannish and it's not unqualified. And in fact, right before this piece was about to be published, when we were like in the proofs stage, he wrote something for New Left Review where he is the first sentence is something like, "Someone wrote to me the other day asking me what my hopes were for 2021," and he's pretty bearish in a lot of ways. And I was like, fuck, is he just like shitting on my whole thesis of this article in this New Left Review blog post? And he's talking about, he feels like, despite his optimism around the Bernie Sanders campaign, he feels like Bernie missed an opportunity. Democratic Socialists of America missed an opportunity. There should have been calls for national mobilizations against Trump's awful coronavirus response. We should have been out in the streets. This is something that he talks about very frequently, that, the left can't give up the streets. Like, we need to be in the streets. He very much believes in working class self-activity. That's like the sine qua non for left revitalization. So he's saying, like, why didn't that happen? So it's not all rosy. But as my editor, David Marcus, pointed out to me, even the fact that that's the argument he's making shows that itself reflects the change in the mood that he's experiencing. Because at least he's saying like, DSA is important. DSA should have done X, Y, Z. DSA could have done X, Y, and Z. Bernie Sanders is important. He should have done X, Y, Z. He could have done X, Y, Z. And so like he's got the social forces that he can point to that could remake the world. And he wants those social forces to go do that. Even when he is being yet again the bearer of bad news, it is in this context that he does feel a bit of more optimism, and I admire that in this guy so much, as somebody who looked unflinchingly at how miserable so much of our world is and how bleak our prospects are for reversing that misery. And he did not look away from it. He stared the truth in the face. He looked into the abyss, and he described what he saw. And so I admire him for that. But he still stuck it out on the left for more than half a century during those really bleak times when he was writing about really bleak things. And so I'm like, you know what? This guy deserves to feel a little optimism here at the twilight of his life. He's now into his 70s, and he deserves to feel like this world might turn around one of these days. And I hope he gets to live to see it, because that is a deserved reward from somebody who stuck it out on the left through these really bleak years.
Absolutely. Well, I really enjoyed the piece. It's a good, since I don't know when I'm going to have the summer to do the Mike Davis deep dive, but until then, it's a really good,
Just put it on the to-do list and see when you get around to it.
All right, fair enough. It's a really, it's a really good piece. So it's amid the wildfires, Mike Davis's forecast for the left at the Nation. Is there anything else you want to plug before you go?
JacobinMag.com. Go read it. It's my default answer. We publish 50 essays a week. I would really like it if you read a couple of them, including ones written by one Ben Burgis.
Yeah, no, especially those ones. So, for sure. should read Jacobin every now and again. You should even read The Nation. This is one of those times.
Well, I saw, Ben, because they've got a paywall where you can only read 3 articles up there, and you've read 2 of them, one of which was mine, and probably the other which was yours that you wrote for The Nation recently. Yeah. I subscribed the other day. I'm now a subscriber to The Nation.
Nice. Yeah, well, I'll even here at the end of something that only patrons are watching this right now. I won't go into all my mixed feelings about that magazine, but they do publish some great stuff, and this is one of them. People should check it out. Thank you so much, Micah.
Thanks, Ben.